Jake had lived in the mountains for as long as he could remember. The towering pines and the craggy peaks were as familiar to him as his own hands, the landscape a constant companion that shaped his quiet existence. A rugged man, he stood tall with broad shoulders, hardened by years of working the land. The only thing he truly owned in this small, isolated town was the bakery that had been passed down to him by his parents. It was a modest place, tucked away on the corner of a dirt road, with windows that never quite let in enough light and a door that always creaked when you pushed it open. Jake never had much of a head for business, but he kept the bakery running, if only just. The work was steady but solitary, and Jake was used to that. His days were filled with the familiar rhythm of bread making, kneading the dough, tending to the oven, and sweeping the floor before the next batch of bread was ready. Most of his time was spent alone, save for the occasional visit from townsfolk who would stop by for a loaf or a cup of coffee. He had no close friends, no family left to speak of, just the quiet company of the bakery and the land that surrounded it. As the years passed, he found comfort in routine. There was something simple and reliable about the tasks he performed each day, even if they sometimes felt like they were done on autopilot. The bakery was his world, and in a way, it filled the empty space in his heart that had been left by the loss of his parents. But things had begun to change, slowly at first, like the seasons creeping over the landscape. Jake had noticed it, even if he didn't want to admit it. The bakery, once a bright and welcoming place, had started to fall into disrepair. Dust had settled on the shelves, the floors were covered in crumbs and flour that hadn't been swept away, and the windows were clouded with grime. Jake had never paid much attention to such things. He was too busy with baking to worry about cleaning. After all, who was going to notice a few specks of dust when the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air? But recently, he had started to notice. Business was slowing down, and the bakery didn't look as inviting as it once had. The townspeople had started to notice, too, whispering about the decline of the once thriving bakery. One morning, as Jake wiped his hands on his apron, he took a step back and looked around the bakery. The sight of the cluttered counters and the neglected floors hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't the place his parents had worked so hard to build. It wasn't the place he had grown up in. It was starting to feel like a prison of his own making, filled with the ghosts of a past that he didn't want to face. For the first time in years, Jake felt the weight of the solitude that had once felt comforting. It was no longer just the bakery and the land he had to tend to. It was a reflection of his life, empty, stale, and worn. With a sigh, Jake decided it was time to make a change. He could no longer juggle baking and keeping the bakery clean on his own. He needed help, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to admit it. It was a small decision, but one that would eventually change everything. He wasn't sure what kind of help he needed, but the idea of bringing someone in to clean the place seemed like a good start. After all, the bakery wasn't just a business. It was his home, and he needed to take care of it. Little did he know, this decision would set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundation of his life and force him to confront the isolation he had so carefully built around himself. But for now, he simply made up his mind. The bakery needed cleaning, and he wasn't going to let it fall apart. He would find someone to help, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone. As the clock ticked on, the quiet life Jake had known for so long began to unravel, setting the stage for something entirely unexpected. Rosie arrived in town quietly, as if trying to blend into the landscape, but the small town didn't let anyone slip by unnoticed for long. She had recently moved to the area, carrying more than just the baby growing inside her. She carried a past marked by hardship. A few years ago, Rosie had lost her husband in a terrible accident. It was an event that still haunted her, and though the pain had dulled over time, it never truly left. She wasn't the same woman she had been before his death. In many ways, she had to rebuild her life from the ground up, one day at a time. Rosie was a quiet, reserved woman who had learned to keep to herself. The townsfolk didn't know much about her. They only knew what they could guess from her appearance. Her pale skin, The way her clothes seemed a little too worn, and the careful, steady way she moved as if every action was deliberate. She didn't talk much, keeping her head down and her thoughts even quieter. As for the baby, Rosie was nearing the final months of her pregnancy, and the weight of it all, the loss, the grief, the uncertainty of the future, was beginning to show in the tired lines on her face. She needed work. The small sewing business she'd run in the city had never paid well, and with a baby on the way, it was no longer enough to make ends meet. She walked into town one morning with only the clothes on her back and a few coins in her pocket. The people in the market eyed her with curiosity, though few approached. Some of the older women offered sympathetic glances, understanding the hardship of a widow, but there were others who whispered behind her back, judging her for her quiet demeanor and her refusal to speak about her past. The town had a way of talking, of speculating, and Rosie felt at the moment she stepped through its gates. For Rosie, the work she needed wasn't just about making money. It was about survival. She couldn't afford luxuries, not even the comfort of a warm home. She had nowhere else to go, so she rented a small, modest room at the inn. The walls were thin and the room was cold at night, but it was hers for the time being. She spent most of her days walking the streets, trying to find something to do, any work she could manage. The townsfolk often took pity on her, offering the occasional odd job, but the pay was minimal, and her stomach grew heavier by the day. Rosie's reputation spread quietly through the town. There were whispers about her husband's death, some claiming that she had been too quick to move on, while others said she was simply trying to survive. There was talk of her being an outsider, of the choices she had made after her husband's passing. She wasn't welcomed with open arms, but neither was she completely shunned. The town offered mixed opinions on Rosie, and that made her feel even more out of place. All she wanted was a way to support herself and the child she was about to bring into the world. But that, it seemed, was going to be harder than she anticipated. Jake, the owner of the bakery, hadn't given much thought to Rosie until his neighbor recommended her for the cleaning job he had been meaning to hire for. He had seen Rosie around town, but hadn't paid her much mind. She was just another face in the crowd, another outsider. But his neighbor's words were enough to spark his curiosity. She needed work, and he needed someone to clean the bakery. It seemed simple enough, but Jake didn't know what a difference hiring Rosie would make. Jake wasn't one to pry into others' lives. He didn't know what had happened to Rosie's husband, nor did he care to ask. His thoughts about her were limited to the fact that she was a pregnant widow trying to make her way in a place that didn't make it easy. Her quiet, reserved nature suited him just fine. It meant she wouldn't bother him with questions or unnecessary chatter. He didn't care for gossip and never really made a habit of getting involved in the lives of others. The bakery was his world, and it was easier that way. Kept to himself, worked alone. But something in Rosie's worn-out eyes made him hesitate before he hired her. There was a silent desperation in her presence, something that told him she wasn't just trying to get by, she was surviving. Jake took her on, mostly because he needed someone and because his neighbor had vouched for her. She didn't ask for much, and she seemed eager to work, which was more than he could say for some people who'd come and gone over the years. Rosie didn't seem like the type to cause trouble, so Jake figured it was a good fit. The first time Rosie walked into the bakery, she held her head low and quietly set to work. Her movements were careful, yet efficient. Jake had never seen anyone clean so thoroughly, scrubbing every surface with a focus that almost seemed deliberate. She didn't say much, only spoke when spoken to, but her work ethic was impressive. As the days passed, Jake found himself thinking about Rosie more than he expected. She was always there, quietly tending to the bakery, making it spotless in ways he had never managed to. The thought of her past didn't linger in his mind. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Rosie's life was her own, and he was fine with that. He respected her space, just as he hoped she respected his. But in the back of his mind, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Rosie than met the eye. She had this quiet strength about her, a resilience that seemed to shine through in everything she did. Rosie didn't talk about her past. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Jake noticed the way she would sit quietly at the end of the day, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she looked out the window, her expression unreadable. He never asked what she thought about. There were some things you didn't pry into. But Rosie's presence began to feel like more than just a hired hand. It felt like a comfort, like a quiet force that was slowly, subtly, changing the atmosphere of the bakery. Jake had hired Rosie to clean, but as the days went by, he began to wonder if there was more to her than the quiet, pregnant widow everyone had whispered about. She wasn't asking for sympathy, but she was silently changing the rhythm of his life. And though he didn't realize it yet, that small decision to hire her was the beginning of a change that would shake both of their worlds in ways they never expected. Rosie arrived early for her first day of work at the bakery. The morning was still quiet, the streets empty, and the sun barely peeking over the horizon. She walked into the bakery with the same quiet determination that seemed to follow her everywhere. The bakery, with its dimly lit corners and dust-covered shelves, looked as if it hadn't seen a real cleaning in months. Rosie didn't hesitate. She rolled up her sleeves, tied her hair back, and immediately got to work. Jake, who had expected her to take some time to settle in, was surprised by how quickly she moved. She didn't waste a single moment. First, she swept the floor, pushing the dust and crumbs into a pile, then went straight to the counters, scrubbing every inch with care. Her movements were deliberate, practiced. Rosie didn't seem to mind the hard work. In fact, it seemed to energize her. She wiped down the windows, making them gleam with the kind of clarity Jake hadn't seen in years. As he watched from behind the counter, Jake couldn't help but feel impressed. He had expected a slow, reluctant worker, but Rosie's efficiency was far beyond what he imagined. The bakery was starting to look different, almost foreign, as if it had been reborn in just a few hours. Every corner, every shelf, every window, Rosie had cleaned them with a thoroughness that made the place shine. She worked without stopping, pausing only briefly to stretch or take a quick breath, but she never stopped moving. There was no hesitation in her actions, no second guessing. She simply worked, and it was clear that she took pride in what she was doing. The transformation wasn't just physical. The air in the bakery itself seemed lighter, fresher. The space that had once felt stale and neglected now had new energy, a new life. The dusty, old bakery had been turned into a welcoming, clean environment, the kind of place people would want to spend their time in. Rosie's hard work wasn't just cleaning the place. It was changing the very atmosphere of the bakery, making it feel like a new beginning. Despite the shift in the bakery, Jake remained distant. He couldn't help but notice Rosie's dedication, the way she took such care in everything she did. Her strength was evident, even in the way she carried herself as she worked. Her quiet determination, the weariness in her eyes, and the grace with which she moved, all of it made Jake pause. But even though he admired her work ethic, he kept his distance. He wasn't used to getting close to people, and he didn't plan to start now. His past had taught him to be wary of forming connections. He had seen the pain that came with trusting people, only to have them leave or disappoint. He wasn't ready to open up to anyone, especially not to Rosie, no matter how hard she worked or how much he admired her strength. As the hours passed, Jake couldn't ignore the growing sense of respect he had for her. Rosie didn't say much, but her actions spoke louder than words ever could. The way she worked so tirelessly, the way she put her all into every task, left Jake with a sense of awe. He could tell that she wasn't just working for the money. She was working because it gave her purpose. She took pride in every single movement, as if the act of cleaning the bakery was as important as the bread he baked. It wasn't just about making the place look good, it was about making it feel right. Yet, Jake still held back. He didn't know what to say to her, or if he should say anything at all. Rosie seemed content in her silence, focused solely on the work at hand. He appreciated that, but part of him felt like he should say something, acknowledge her effort. But his past made it hard for him to open up. He had learned to keep his thoughts and feelings to himself, and it was easier that way. People, he had learned, always left. It was better not to get too attached. As the day went on, Rosie finished the last of the cleaning, leaving the bakery in pristine condition. The floors shone, the counters sparkled, and the windows let in the warm sunlight, giving the whole place a glow. Rosie stepped back and took a moment to look around, her tired eyes softening as she saw the results of her hard work. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the satisfaction in the way she held herself. She was proud of what she had done. Jake walked over to her, still unsure of how to act. He nodded at the clean bakery and said, "Looks good, really good." It wasn't much, but it was all he could muster. He didn't know what else to say. Rosie gave him a small smile, her face tired but content. "Thank you," she replied quietly, and then she gathered her things and left for the day, just as quietly as she had come. Jake stood there for a moment, watching her leave. He hadn't expected to feel so unsettled. It wasn't just the work she had done, it was the way she did it. The way she carried herself, the strength in her silence, the quiet grace she exuded. He didn't know much about her, but he couldn't help but think that there was more to Rosie than met the eye. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. He wasn't here to figure out people's pasts. He had his own work to do. But as he returned to his own tasks, he found that Rosie's presence lingered in the bakery longer than she had. The place no longer felt the same. It felt different, brighter, more alive. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was as if something inside him had shifted too, though he couldn't yet put his finger on what it was. He had hired her to clean the bakery, but it seemed that, in the process, Rosie had done something more, something that had nothing to do with cleaning. As the days passed, Jay couldn't help but notice Rosie more and more. She had become a steady presence in the bakery, working tirelessly and efficiently, her quiet demeanor always the same. But as much as he observed her, there was one thing that puzzled him. She never spoke about her past. It wasn't that she was rude or secretive. She simply avoided the topic whenever it came up. People in the town whispered about her late husband, some with sympathy, others with judgment, but Rosie herself never spoke of him. She never mentioned how he had died, what kind of man he had been, or why she had ended up in the small town, pregnant and alone. Jake respected her silence. After all, he was no stranger to keeping things to himself, and it wasn't his place to ask about matters she clearly didn't want to discuss. Still, the more time Jake spent around Rosie, the more his curiosity grew. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, hardworking, humble, and determined, yet guarded in a way that suggested there was more beneath the surface. Jake couldn't help but wonder what had shaped her into the woman she was. He'd never seen someone so focused, so dedicated to every task, no matter how small. She worked in a way that made everything seem effortless, but Jake knew it wasn't. There was a quiet strength in Rosie, something that went beyond her ability to clean or bake. It was in the way she moved, the way she spoke so little yet made such a large impact. There was something resilient about her, but it was a resilience that seemed wrapped in sadness, like she had carried burdens much heavier than what anyone could see. Though they spoke very little, a connection started to form between them, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. Rosie would often ask Jake if he wanted extra bread for his meals, a small gesture that felt strangely personal. Jake, in return, would offer her tea when she worked late, and sometimes they would sit together in silence, sharing a brief moment of peace after the long day. It wasn't much, but there was a kind of understanding between them, a silent agreement that, while neither of them spoke about their lives outside the bakery, there was an unspoken care for one another. They had built this small routine, these quiet exchanges that were slowly turning into something more. Jake found himself looking forward to these moments, even if he couldn't put a name to the feeling growing inside him. But as much as they had begun to build a small, quiet connection, Rosie's struggles were far from over. Her pregnancy, which had seemed manageable at first, became more difficult as the weeks went by. The physical toll was becoming evident, and Jake couldn't help but notice how tired she looked as the days stretched on. She had always been a picture of quiet strength, but now there was a weariness in her eyes that couldn't be ignored. Rosie's movements slowed, and she started taking longer breaks between tasks. It was clear that the strain of working while carrying the baby was taking its toll, but she never complained. She simply kept going, pushing through it as best as she could. One afternoon, as Rosie worked late into the evening, Jake noticed that she seemed especially pale. She had been wiping down the counters when she suddenly stopped, a look of dizziness crossing her face. Before he could react, she collapsed, her knees buckling beneath her. Jake rushed to her side, panic rising in his chest. He had never seen her like this, and it terrified him. He gently lifted her and carried her to the nearest chair, his mind racing. Rosie's breathing was shallow, and her face was flushed. She looked weak, far weaker than he had ever seen her. He cursed himself for not noticing the signs earlier. Without thinking, Jake ran to the door and called for help. He knew the local doctor's office wasn't far, so he wasted no time in taking her there. As he carried Rosie through the streets, his heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't help but feel responsible, even though he knew this wasn't something he could have prevented. Rosie was in no condition to walk, and he wasn't sure how long she had been feeling this way. The thought of losing her, of her collapsing again, filled him with a strange dread. The doctor, an older man with a steady hand and a calm demeanor, quickly assessed the situation. He explained that Rosie was simply exhausted, that her pregnancy had taken a toll on her body, and that she needed rest. It was nothing too serious, but the doctor made it clear that she could not continue working at such a pace without risking her health. Jake listened carefully, his mind still reeling from the sight of Rosie fainting. He didn't know much about pregnancy, but it was clear that this was more than just physical fatigue. Rosie needed care, and for the first time, Jake realized that he wanted to be the one to provide it. As they left the doctor's office, Rosie was much quieter than usual. She leaned on Jake for support as they walked back to the bakery, her steps slow and measured. She was clearly embarrassed by her collapse, but Jake could tell that she was grateful for the help. When they returned to the bakery, Jake insisted she take the next few days off to rest, much to Rosie's surprise. She tried to protest, but Jake was firm. He wouldn't let her continue working in her condition. He hadn't realized just how much he had started to care for her until that moment. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was someone he felt responsible for. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but the quiet, pregnant widow had somehow become someone important to him. The days that followed were different. Rosie rested as much as she could, and Jake kept the bakery running on his own. It wasn't easy, but he didn't mind. He spent more time thinking about Rosie than he had in a long while. He wondered about her past, about the life she had left behind, about the struggles she must have faced. But he also started to see her in a new light, stronger, more resilient than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just the quiet woman who cleaned his bakery. She was someone who had survived loss, who had endured more than most people could handle, and yet still carried herself with grace. For the first time in a long while, Jake began to understand what it meant to care for someone beyond the surface. Rosie's quiet resilience had touched something deep within him, something he hadn't realized he was missing. He had spent so many years shutting people out, building walls to protect himself from the pain of connection. But now, with Rosie, those walls were beginning to crumble. He wasn't sure where this was leading, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to see where it might go. One evening, the warm glow from the bakery's windows spilled out onto the street as a small group of townsfolk entered. Jake was busy behind the counter, kneading some dough for the next batch. When they walked in, their voices carrying a tone of gossip. He had grown used to the occasional chatter in the bakery, but tonight, something felt different. The group, mostly older women, huddled close together, exchanging glances before one of them spoke up. "Did you hear about Rosie?" One woman whispered, her voice barely above a murmur, though it was loud enough for Jake to catch every word. "She's got quite the story." Another woman added, lowering her voice further, casting a furtive glance toward the back of the bakery, where Rosie was quietly working. Her husband, well, it wasn't just an accident, they say. Jake paused mid-motion, a knot tightening in his stomach. He had never pried into Rosie's past. She had always kept her distance, and he had respected that. But the women's words now piqued his interest, and he couldn't help but listen. The first woman continued, her eyes scanning the bakery as if checking for any eavesdroppers. Some say her husband was involved in some shady dealings, she said with a slight smirk. Things no one in this town would want to be mixed up in. No wonder she ran off so suddenly. The others nodded, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Jake felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. Rosie had always been kind to him, always diligent in her work, and he couldn't believe she could be involved in anything sinister. But the whispers continued, each passing moment making him more uneasy. They say she's hiding something, one woman whispered. What kind of woman leaves like that, pregnant and all? She's got a past she's not sharing. The talk swirled around Jake like smoke, filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. His mind raced. He had hired Rosie without asking any questions about her past, trusting that she was just trying to get by. But now, as the gossip poured in, doubts began to creep in. He had seen her quiet resilience, her strength, but had she been hiding something much darker? The possibility of a dangerous past, one filled with secrets and perhaps even lies, made Jake question whether he had made the right choice in hiring her. As the women left, their gossip still echoing in the corners of the bakery, Jake remained behind the counter, his hands frozen in place. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was Rosie running from something? Was she really the person he had come to respect? Or had he been blind to her past? In the days that followed, Jake found it harder to shake the suspicion that had begun to grow in his mind. Every time he saw Rosie working, he couldn't help but wonder about her. She was so quiet, so determined, too determined, maybe. Why was she so careful with every detail of her life? And why did she avoid any questions about her past? Her husband's death, the rumors of illegal dealings, it all made Jake's gut twist. He had never thought of her as dangerous, but the more the rumors played on his mind, the more he questioned what he really knew about her. Despite his growing suspicion, Jake's empathy for Rosie also deepened. She worked tirelessly, always the first one in and the last one out, never asking for more than what she needed. Her quiet strength and resilience were not the actions of someone who was trying to deceive him. But still, the questions lingered in his mind. Should he confront her about what he had heard? Or was it better to ignore the whispers and continue trusting her? Every time he thought about bringing it up, a part of him hesitated. What if she really was hiding something? What if he was wrong about her? One evening, after a long and tiring day of work, Rosie sat down at the table in the bakery, her hands nervously wringing together. Jake had finished cleaning up, and the shop was quiet, with only the sound of the crackling fire in the corner. Rosie looked tired, her face pale, and her eyes seemed more distant than usual. "Jake," she began softly, her voice quiet but firm, "I need to tell you something." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting something, but not this. He set down the dish towel and walked over to her, his curiosity getting the best of him. "I've heard the rumors," Rosie said, her voice faltering slightly, "about my past. I know what people have been saying." She took a deep breath and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "The truth is, my husband, he wasn't who you think he was. He was involved in things that I didn't know about at first, things that were dangerous." Jake's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected this confession, but now that she was finally speaking, he listened carefully, his mind racing with questions. Rosie paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "He was involved in some illegal dealings, things that he kept hidden from me. I never knew the extent of it until it was too late. And when he died, I ran. I had to. I couldn't stay, knowing that the people he was involved with would come looking for me, for us. I didn't want to live that life. So I left. I ran, and I came here, hoping to start over, hoping to forget." Jake sat down across from her, his heart pounding. He had suspected there was more to her past, but hearing it from her own lips was different. It was raw, vulnerable, and honest. Rosie had been running, trying to escape the darkness of her past. She had never intended to hurt anyone, but the weight of the life she had been forced to leave behind had followed her. She had carried the burden of her choices in silence. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to lie to you, Jake. I just didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want you to think I was like him." Jake sat back in his chair, his mind whirling. He had always known Rosie as the quiet, hardworking woman who kept to herself, but now he realized there was so much more to her than he had ever understood. She wasn't just running from a dangerous past. She was running to build a better life for herself and her child. For a long moment, Jake said nothing. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. The past that Rosie had been running from was darker than he had imagined, but the truth had brought them closer in a way that no silence ever could. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have to apologize. I understand." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "You're not alone anymore, Rosie. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." Rosie's eyes filled with gratitude, but also with a trace of uncertainty. "You're not mad?" she asked quietly. Jake shook his head, his heart heavy but full. "No, I'm not mad. But I want you to know this. I'll stand by you. I'll help you, whatever it takes. You're not running anymore." In that moment, Jake realized that he didn't just care for Rosie as an employee or a neighbor. He cared for her as a person, as someone who had been through more than most could bear, yet still had the strength to keep moving forward. The past, though it haunted her, would no longer define her. And neither would the town's gossip. Jake had made his choice, and it was clear he wasn't going to turn his back on her. One afternoon, as Jake worked in the bakery, a tall, rough-looking man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before locking on a Rosie behind the counter. "Are you Rosie?" he asked, his voice low and demanding. Rosie froze, her face paling, and Jake immediately felt a surge of tension. Something about the man's presence didn't sit right with him. Without waiting for a reply, the man said, "I need to talk to you now." Rosie, clearly uneasy, tried to steady herself, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, placing himself between the stranger and Rosie. "She's not talking to you," Jake said firmly. "You'd better leave." The man sneered, sizing up Jake. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" he asked. "She owes me answers." Jake's protective instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a casual encounter. The man's tone screamed danger. "I'm telling you to leave now," Jake replied, his body tense and ready to act. The stranger paused, then grunted in frustration. "This isn't over. I'll be back for you," he muttered before turning and walking out, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet street. Rosie stood still behind the counter, visibly shaken. Jake watched her, his chest tight with concern. She wasn't just afraid. There was guilt in her eyes and something deeper that she wasn't saying. Slowly, he approached her. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with care. Rosie nodded weakly, her hands trembling. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's from my past. He's one of them, the people I ran from." Jake's heart sank. He had known Rosie was escaping something, but hearing her confirm it made everything more real. The danger was far from over. "What does he want?" Jake asked, his voice low, his concern growing. Rosie swallowed hard, her eyes avoiding his. "I want to find me. He wants me to pay for leaving, for taking what wasn't mine." Jake's mind raced as he connected the dots about her past, the threats, the dangerous people, her husband's involvement. It was clear now that Rosie couldn't just leave her past behind. It had a way of finding her, no matter how far she ran. "You're safe here," Jake said, his voice firm. "I won't let anyone hurt you." For the first time, Rosie looked at him with a hint of belief. "I don't want to bring this to your doorstep. You don't owe me anything." Jake shook his head, his expression resolute. "You don't need to worry about that. No one's going to hurt you here." As the stranger's words echoed in Jake's mind, he realized that the danger was just beginning. The past had returned, and he wasn't sure how to protect Rosie from it. But one thing was clear: he wouldn't let her face it alone. The threat had only just begun, but Jake was ready to face it, no matter the cost. After the confrontation with the stranger, Rosie couldn't shake the feeling that the past she had tried to escape had finally caught up with her. The man's presence, his threats, and the tension in the air all reminded her of the danger she had been running from. She knew staying in town wasn't an option anymore, not just for her own safety, but for Jake's as well. The people who had shown her kindness might soon be at risk too. That night, Rosie sat alone in her room above the bakery, her thoughts a whirl of confusion. She had to leave to protect everyone, even though she didn't know where she would go or what the future held. The thought of staying while danger crept closer felt unbearable. She had tried to start over, but the past was always there, lurking. The next morning, Rosie went to Jake, her heart heavy with the decision she had made. He was kneading dough, as usual, but he looked worn and tired, clearly still thinking about the confrontation. Rosie knew she couldn't keep this from him any longer. "Jake," she said softly, her voice shaky, "I can't stay here anymore." Jake paused, his brow furrowed in confusion, but he said nothing. Rosie's heart clenched, but she continued. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That man, he's just the beginning. I can't let you get dragged into this. I've already brought too much danger to this town, and I can't put you at risk." Jake's expression darkened. He realized Rosie wasn't just worried about herself. She was worried about him too. That realization hit him hard. "You don't have to leave," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let them hurt you." Rosie shook her head. "I can't stay. I have to go somewhere far away where they can't find me. I don't know where, but I can't stay here anymore. You've done so much for me already, and I can't thank you enough. You gave me a chance when I had nothing, but this is something I have to do on my own." Jake stood there, stunned, unable to find the words. The thought of losing Rosie made his chest tighten. He had grown so accustomed to her presence, to her quiet companionship, that the idea of never seeing her again seemed impossible. "I don't want to lose you," Jake said quietly. "I never wanted this for you." Rosie's heart ached at his words. "I don't want to leave you either, but I have to, for both our sakes." Jake stood still, torn between wanting to protect her and knowing she had to make this choice. He wanted to keep her safe, but he also knew that her safety came first, even if it meant letting her go. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, but there was an understanding between them. Jake didn't want her to leave, but he knew that if he loved her, he had to respect her decision. The town, the bakery, and their quiet moments together weren't enough to keep her from running. The danger was too real, and he couldn't shield her from it. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Jake said softly, "but I can't stop you." Rosie reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "You've already done so much for me. You've given me hope when I thought I had none. I'll never forget what you did for me." Jake's heart broke as he looked at her. He had never expected to care for someone this much, but Rosie had changed that. She had reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there was still kindness, still love to be found. "You'll be okay," Jake said quietly. "You're stronger than you think. You've made it this far. If you need anything, you know where to find me." Rosie smiled, her face filled with sadness and gratitude. "I will. I'll always remember you, Jake. Thank you for everything." She turned to leave, but before she did, Jake stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Rosie. Stay safe." "I will," she whispered. They stood there for a moment, lost in their thoughts, before Rosie walked out of the bakery and into an uncertain future. Jake watched her leave, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the last time he would see her. The door closed behind her, and the bakery felt emptier than it ever had. Jake remained in the silence, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had wanted to protect Rosie, to keep her close, but he knew that she had to face her past alone. As the day passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end, that somehow their paths would cross again. He only hoped it would be under better circumstances, free from the shadows of her past. For now, he had to let her go. It was the hardest decision he had made, but he knew it was the right one. Rosie had escaped her past, but the road ahead was still uncertain. All Jake could do was hope she would find the peace she deserved. Months passed, and life in the bakery slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Jake kept himself busy, baking bread, cleaning the shop, and maintaining the small piece of land he had inherited. The days felt long at times, filled with the quiet hum of the bakery, but there was always a lingering emptiness. Rosie's absence weighed on him more than he had expected. Despite his best efforts to move on, he couldn't shake the memory of her. The way she had worked so tirelessly, the quiet strength in her eyes, and the promise of something more that they had never fully explored. Every so often, Jake found himself thinking about her, wondering where she was and how she was doing. Had she found peace? Was she safe? He couldn't help but feel a sense of longing, a hope that one day she might return. It was an ache that lingered in the corners of his mind, something he hadn't anticipated when he let her go. Then, one morning, just as Jake was about to open the bakery, the door swung open and Rosie walked in. She was standing there, a little thinner, a little different, but it was unmistakably her. She looked at him with a mixture of uncertainty and determination in her eyes. She wasn't the same woman who had left months ago. Rosie had changed. Jake's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Rosie simply stood there, taking in the familiar surroundings, the bakery that had once been her refuge. It was as if she had stepped out of the past, but now, with a new purpose in life. Her face was no longer filled with fear. It had been replaced with a sense of calm, a kind of peace that Jake hadn't seen in her before. "I'm back," Rosie said softly, her voice steady. Jake's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this moment, hadn't prepared for it. "You're safe?" he asked, his voice hesitant but filled with concern. Rosie nodded. "I am. I'm starting over. I had to leave to escape the past, but I found a place where I can finally breathe. I'm not running anymore, Jake." Jake stood there for a long moment, taking in her words. Something inside him shifted. He had always respected Rosie's strength, but now he saw her in a new light. She was no longer a woman running from her past. She was a woman taking control of her future. As Rosie spoke about her new life, about the steps she had taken to rebuild, Jake realized something deep within himself. He had never truly let her go, not in the way he had tried to convince himself. He hadn't just cared for her. He had wanted to be a part of her life. A real part, not just a passing chapter. "I don't want to lose you again," Jake admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want your past to define us. I want to build something with you, Rosie. A real future. One we can share, no secrets, no shadows. Just us." Rosie looked at him, her eyes softening as she listened. She had been through so much, and the weight of her past had often felt too heavy to bear. But here, in this small bakery, she saw something different. She saw someone who cared for her not out of pity, but out of love. Someone who wanted to help her build a new life, not just for herself, but together. "I'm ready," Rosie said, her voice steady. "I'm stronger now, and I know what I want. I want to stay here. Not just for me, but for you too. I know we can face anything together, even the shadows of my past. I don't want to run anymore. I want to build a life here with you." Jake's heart swelled with relief and joy. The weight he had been carrying, the uncertainty, the longing, everything began to lift. They both had their pasts, but they no longer had to let those pasts control them. Together, they could start fresh, create something that was entirely their own. The days that followed were filled with a sense of newfound hope. Jake and Rosie worked side by side in the bakery, rebuilding not just the business but their bond. They shared meals together, their conversations deeper now, filled with laughter and dreams of a future they could create. The bakery, once a place of quiet solitude for Jake, was now a space where they both felt at home. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. As they built their new life together, Rosie found herself becoming a part of the town, not as an outsider, but as someone who had earned her place. She was no longer the pregnant widow running from the past. She was Rosie, a strong woman who had faced her demons and had chosen to move forward. The people in the town saw her differently now. They saw her strength, her resilience, and her kindness. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was a woman living with purpose. Jake, too, had changed. The man who had once kept to himself, afraid of opening his heart, now found joy in the simple moments with Rosie. They made plans for the future, no longer burdened by the shadows of what had been. And each day, their bond grew stronger, their connection deepening in ways neither of them had expected. One evening, as they stood together on the porch of the bakery, looking out at the quiet town, Rosie turned to Jake, a smile playing on her lips. "I never thought I would find peace," she said softly. "But with you, I think I've finally found it." Jake smiled back, his arm around her shoulders. "We've both found it," he replied. Together. As the sun set over the mountains, the future stretched out before them, bright and full of possibilities. They had come a long way from the strangers they once were, and now they had a family, not by blood but by choice. They had created a new beginning, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of tomorrow. And for the first time in a long while, both Jake and Rosie knew that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. Jake stood by the bakery window, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the land. The quiet of the evening had always been his companion, the soft rustle of the trees and the distant calls of the birds comforting him in his solitude. But now, with Rosie beside him, the silence felt different. It wasn't lonely anymore. It was filled with meaning, with connection. He could still remember the days before she came into his life, the days when he had kept to himself, wrapped in the safety of his routines, never allowing anyone to get too close. Rosie's arrival had turned his world upside down. At first, he hadn't understood it. She had brought with her not just her past, but a sense of vulnerability that made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to caring for anyone, and the thought of letting someone into his life, someone with so much weight on her shoulders, seemed daunting. But over time, he had watched her strength, her courage to rebuild from the wreckage of her past. Rosie had taught him that love wasn't about forgetting the past or trying to escape it. Love was about moving forward together, sharing the burdens and the joys, and finding a way to build something new from what had been broken. Jake had learned that love was about the present. It was about the quiet moments they shared, the laughter they found in the small things, and the quiet understanding between them. It was about looking forward to the future, not clinging to the past. The way Rosie had let him into her heart, despite everything she had gone through, showed him that love was a choice to open yourself up to someone else, no matter the risk. As he stood beside her now, Jake realized that their journey was just beginning. The pain of their past would always be there, but it no longer defined them. Together, they had created a life filled with hope, with new beginnings, and with a love that was stronger than the struggles they had faced. It was no longer about who they had been. It was about who they were becoming and the family they were building. The wind blew gently, and Rosie's hand found Jake's, her fingers lacing through his. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he would be there for her no matter what. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the valley, they stood together, looking out at the world they had made their own. It wasn't perfect. Life never was. But it was theirs, and that was enough. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities, full of the unknown. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt at peace. With Rosie by his side, he knew they could face whatever came their way. The mountains stood still in the fading light, their peaks bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Together, Jake and Rosie were ready for whatever came next, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face it all.